Herzlichen Dank für die Einladung.
Thank you for the invitation and your lovely presentation.
Gestatten Sie mir ein Wort zuvor.
Please allow me to start an introduction. The last verse of Hölderlin's hymn Remembrance is, "And poets establish that which endures." Looking at the poet's complete work, we would have to accompany this sentence by a second one, which could be, "And poets accompany that which vanishes." Enduring and vanishing, both are processes that are of utmost importance to Hölderlin. He doesn't only want to consider them natural processes, rather they need a specific act, which he for which he uses the word of establishing or founding. What's important to Hölderlin is, in the darkness, there'll be something for us to hold on to.
Nicht alles.
Something, not everything. Some things are also allowed to vanish, but need to find a last expression in song, poetry, art.
Ich komme zum Thema der Tagung und beginne mit einem ersten Punkt.
I will now start this topic with something that I like to call space and time and space. The topic of this conference, Archiving the Present, Caring for Public Art in the Future, is most fundamentally a question that deals with time and space.
Offensichtlich stellt die Bewahrung
The conservation of contemporary art
vor ein Raumproblem
is a space problem and forces us to choose. What do we want to conserve?
Allerdings liest man in einem
In one of the concept papers for our conference, I read,
Bundesimmobiliengesetz
BIG considers all works of art that it manages as equal. End of quote.
der Raum für die Archivierung von
Space for archiving pieces of art is scarce.
muss sich vor
Every choice needs to be justified in the face of the principle of equality.
muss vor diesem
It needs to prevail.
Es geht dabei aber nicht allein um ein
However, it's not only a problem of space, but also a problem of time.
es wird besonders virulent.
This becomes especially visible and problematic when looking at aging pieces of art. They do not only need to be archived, but also preserved and restored.
Eine große Herausforderung. Das
This brings a large challenge, and this is a topic of this conference as well.
blickt man wieder auf das Konzeptpapier der Tagung.
Looking at the concept paper, the issue of time is also cited at another point.
Die Gleichzeitigkeit einer
A
rasanten
rapidly increasing art production
mit dem
and the simultaneous need to preserve cultural values seems symptomatic for the elimination of a linear perception of time, which doesn't only raise concerns about the loss of our past,
die Sorge den Verlust der Vergangenheit hervorbringt,
but it also brings about a dystopian model of the future,
das kulturelle wie
which deeply penetrates our society's cultural and political understanding. End of quote.
nach der Erhaltung zeitgenössischer
Asking about conservation and preservation of contemporary works of art,
Texte nehmen,
there's another question which is connected to it. The question of which elements of the past we want to conserve and how we imagine the future.
der Problematik an diesem
In this complex portrayal of the issue, I felt instantly drawn to
von der
this part of the quote which says, "The elimination of linear perception of time."
Leute, in die wir weiterdenken sollen.
For me, this gives a direction that we are invited to pursue. The actual problem, in my view, is a linear perception of time.
Deren Auflösung
Its elimination is an opportunity.
zur linearen Zeitvorstellung.
I'd like to delve into linear perception of time. Following Newton's conception of time,
Die Zeit als
time is a mere sequence of quantified units.
welche sukzessive Vergangenheit, Gegenwart,
which go through past, present, and future, one after the other.
dargestellt
It
werden
can be depicted as a number line. And following this train of thoughts,
als bloße
pieces of art are mere objects that were created at a certain point in time, that endure a certain time, that might be reproducible, that might be archived,
Altern beginnen,
that will start aging at a certain time,
besonderen.
and that will need special care and conservation measures.
Das lässt sich, wie gesagt, auf einem
All this can be depicted on a number line.
innerhalb dieser Denkform
Following this train of thought, the question of preserving and letting go of works of art seems to be a merely external question,
Objekte richten.
focusing on artworks as objects.
Mit Kunstwerken
Examination artworks
Stellung in
can question this linear perception of time, though.
Präsentation gesehen, die in der Pause
You might have seen the presentation we saw during the break of the students' projects.
geheißen
One is called
Unpredictable
Object with an Unpredictable Past.
Future, sondern
It's not called an unpredictable future, but an unpredictable past.
schon an diesem Projekt, wie
This project already shows how linear perceptions of time are being meddled with.
differenzierte Zeitformen können,
Different forms of time can appear
für die wir gar keine bestimmten Begriffe
for which we don't even have specified terms. The three ecstasies of time, past, present, and future, are not enough, by far,
Formen zu
to describe the complexity of time forms, which can be made visible in works of art.
Kunstwerke
Works of art bring us face to face with an experience of time for which we lack predefined terms.
sagen, man muss ja an diesen Kunstwerken auch
We could say that it will have to be invented, even.
die Frage nach dem
I would like to suggest taking this point of view
Konferenz geht,
of preserving and letting go of works of art,
nach dem Erhalten und
and
Abnehmen von Kunst
looking at it from this perspective.
zur Frage,
This question transforms and becomes the question
als
of which significance preserving and letting go as modes of art.
Abschied nehmen selbst in
In what manner are preserving and letting go inherent characteristics of art?
nach einem langfristigen Umgang
Which pointers can be derived for the answering the question to long-term care for public art?
die Kunstwerke wären dann nicht mehr bloße Objekte,
Pieces of art would no longer be mere objects of how we deal with them, but they become subjects of the processes of preserving and letting go.
einen weiteren Abschnitt
I would now
wenig zusammen
like to open a short
mit dem Thema Religion zu tun hat.
a short bracket which has something to do with what I do professionally, religion, the religion dimension of the question.
Die Inhalte
Questions of how to care for pieces of art are deeply related to questions that have long been key to religions. It becomes evident that religion and aesthetics are interconnected.
sowohl bei religiösen als auch bei
The following structural analogy can apply. Both religious and artistic objects are items, if we can use that term, that elude daily use.
besonderen Sphäre
They are part of a particular sphere of the sacred or the secluded,
zumindest nicht in erster Linie
which is not primarily part of consumption.
sich Bedeutung
In this sphere, meaning is generated on a very special
zum Beispiel
basis.
Ikone, ein Altarbild ist
An image of Christ, for example, is not a portrait of a special person,
im Bereich der Kunst gewendet.
or
Entwurf irgendwie
if we take the
kein Fazit.
sphere of art, a car designed by Erwin Wurm is not just a vehicle.
Gebrauch in einer bestimmten Weise.
These
Mindestens
objects are not used as they usually are.
des Übergangs
At least since Roman religion, we know about the special significance of the transition between the spheres of the sacred and the secular.
zu lesen, relegere,
Rules were to be reserved. We can read that again and again. relegere,
zu beachten und immer wieder zu lesen,
those rules had to be read again and again, of how to
übernommen,
take something
wie es
from day-to-day use to the sacred sphere and vice versa.
heute relevant. Denken wir
This has stayed relevant until nowadays. Just think about profanation of sacred spaces that will not be used as sacred spaces in the future. In an act of profanation, these are
es handelt sich also,
converted into another form of use.
könnte man sagen,
This is
dass die Religion
on the threshold between theology and judicial, which history of religion has dealt with since Roman antiquity.
Irene Stengs beschreibt,
Just think about sacred waste, as Irene Stengs describes it.
that cannot be disposed of as just garbage, but neither can be kept or left alone. Its ambiguous nature, charged with a religious, moral, or emotional value on the one hand, but at the same time a kind of leftover for which no proper destination exists, makes sacred waste precarious matter, and hence often a ground for conflict and contestation. Wie entsorgt man Objekte der
How to dispose of objects of the religious sphere that no longer fulfill their role within this area?
aus der katholischen Tradition
What does Catholic religion do if the host kept in the tabernacle,
Christi
considered to be the body of Christ, are no longer edible?
mit Devotionalien
What do you do with devotional objects which are brought to a specific site for worship but will have to be removed at a certain time? What to do with a copy of the Holy Bible
des göttlichen
which
symbolisiert hat?
is considered the present of God's word in a sacred space, but it has gotten worn with use
Diskussion geht
and has to be disposed of?
böse Objekte in engeren
This discussion, however, goes far beyond religious objects.
An
What do we do with all the locks that couples in love mount on bridges, but that become too heavy?
der beiden Partner
They bear the names of the partners, but will have to be disposed of at a certain point in time, as the bridge railings just get too heavy.
Orte oder Orte eines Abenteuers
What should we do with objects that are placed in sites of accidents or attacks in order to create forms of memory, as we've heard by Gerald Bast in this morning?
unaussprechlichen Buchstaben
Torah scrolls and other scriptures containing the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, are not thrown out if they decompose, but they're buried.
Genitzer,
They're first placed in a Genisa, which is where liturgical scriptures are kept, and are then buried at a Jewish cemetery.
katholischen Kirchen gibt es einen
For the profanation of Catholic churches, there is an individual rite, which becomes a rite of passage. Just to cite a passage from the German Bishops' Conference,
heißt dort,
which says,
letztes Mal soll die
"One last time,
profanierende Kirche,
Holy Mass will be celebrated in this
an deren Ende kann
church.
das Regierungsdekret
At the end, the edict of profanation can be read,
Widmung der Kirche
with which the bishop orders the rededication of the church.
genommen und
Then the Blessed Sacrament is taken from the tabernacle, the eternal flame is blown out. Thus, all those present experience that this building is no longer available for Mass and prayers."
darüber hinaus werden dann
End of quote.
andere
Other relics are also to be taken from the altar
andere
and other liturgical objects and items of furniture which point to the use as a church.
Gottesdienst an
The quote continues. On the other hand, Mass on the occasion of a church's profanation must not be backward-looking only. The believers who celebrated liturgy in this church are to have a space to assemble for Mass in the future.
soll doch in einer Prozess
So it is proposed that there be a procession to the new church to which the congregation will belong from now on,
diesen Ort
and thus welcome this new church and accept it.
auch Kunstwerke sind
Works of art,
Differenzierung
despite all the distinction in the term of aura by Walter Benjamin,
Sphäre angesichts
are located in a sphere
täglicher Bedeutung
which is far from the mechanisms of daily significance.
entsorgt werden müssen.
What do we do if we have to dispose of works of art?
Durchlaufen
Do they also have to go through a certain act of profanation?
in ähnlicher
Art has similar questions as religions do.
Die Religionen haben Akte des Abschieds
Religions have acts of letting go of objects that are part of the sacred sphere.
zum zweiten großen Punkt der
My second part of my presentation
einzelner
focuses on the question of time structures of individual works of art, one sculpture in particular. I will show them to you
Genaueres dazu sagen.
now and then present them
Was ist
later on.
mit der Zeitstruktur eines Kunstwerks?
What do I mean when I say time structures of works of art? I talk about a sculpture that has become part of the program Public Art in Lower Austria, and I'll ask about its inner time structure.
Aus dem Jahr
This is the sculpture behind the horizon by Gorsha Hall, which was erected in 2010 at the Melk Abbey.
Cornelia Offergeld schreibt über das Kunst
Cornelia Offergeld writes,
unterschiedliche Dinge so dargestellt,
different things are shown as if they were lying behind an imaginary horizon
metaphorisch
to suggest a reality
jenseits.
beyond empirical experience to the viewer.
Das gelingt dem Künstler durch den
The artist achieves that by using a special lens on the camera
eine umgekehrte
that reverses the perspective view in a manner familiar from medieval depictions.
Im Park hat Gorsha Hall 14
Gorsha Hall, for the sculpture in the park, photographed 4 key objects from the Abbey's museum using this lens. Among others, an 11th century portable altar.
den 4 Leitfaden
The photographs were dyed with 4 key colors from the Abbey Museum spaces, cut into stripes, and each pressed onto wooden posts.
durch Bewegung erschließen.
The result is that the viewer has to be moving to see the images.
Länge herumgeht,
Only when one has been around the 2.5 meters tall and 3.4 meters long sculptures do the strips of image flow together to provide the 4 views.
der Aufstellung des Kunstwerkes sind die dargestellten
10 years after the work of art has been erected, the items depicted have reached the horizon. Exposed to the weather,
Stände
they've become weather-worn and barely recognizable.
Zierbarkeit getreten.
They have entered
Der Historie
the sphere behind the horizon of identifiability.
auch sein eigenes
Shall we restore this work of art?
Zeit
Or is the way how this work of art makes its own fading visible important as well? It is subject to the passing of its own time, and it doesn't conceal that.
des Pragalkirchens aus dem
We'll now focus on one of the 4 depictions. It's one of the most important and oldest treasures at Melk Abbey. It's the portable altar.
Kunstwerk
Gorsha Hall photographed a work of art that was 900 years older,
die im Lauf von 10
and thus created a sculpture which became weather-worn within 10 years.
Jahren an jedem
Within this period, no notable changes to the object that was photographed
Arbeiten waren in diesen 10 Jahren nicht.
happened. No restoration was needed.
Das meine ich jetzt vollkommen wertfrei, sondern ich möchte darauf hinweisen, dass
I'm not trying to imply any value. These are 2 very different life cycles of artistic objects. One sculpture, which changed as it was weather-worn,
und ein Objekt
and one object,
der Ausstellungsbedingungen
which, under exposition conditions, did not undergo any changes during that period.
eine Kunstform, die sehr
Of course, photography is a form of art which is very interconnected with technical reproducibility. There might be negatives, and the photos could be renewed and reapplied to the sculpture.
Kirchen dessen Seiten
This is not possible for the portable altar,
ist der
which sides are made of reliefs of walrus teeth.
verlorenen Seite
One of those sides has long been lost, and it is impossible to renew it.
zur Verfügung stehen.
We would not have legal access to the material anymore.
Seite, aber auch kein
And there are also no images of this missing side.
Kunstwerk, eine Form unwiederbringlich.
So there is an irreplaceable loss to this object, even if we're talking about a very different period of time here. Let us think beyond that. The sides of this portable altar
Szenen aus der
show scenes from the Nativity Scene Story and from the Passion narrative.
Hier sehen Sie die Szenen aus der Geburt.
What you see here are the Nativity Story scenes.
Erzählungen, die sich in den
These stories can be found in the Gospels
Heiligen Schriften
as they are
überliefert sind.
transmitted in the New Testament.
Im 1. Jahrhunderts unserer
They
Zeit.
date back to the 1st century AD.
Den Gorscher Halskunst
The period separating Gorsche Hall's work of art and the portable altar is just as long as the period separating the portable altar and the origin of the stories depicted,
Jahrhunderte,
a little more than 9 centuries each. Isn't that astonishing?
die jeweils einen gleich langen
Two very different pieces of art spanning the same period of time
zweiten
and communicating with the former work of art. This second transition, however, undergoes a change in material.
könnte man sagen,
At first, when changing from photography to relief,
im Bereich dreidimensionaler
we
Skulptur
remained in the era of three-dimensional sculpture.
einen Wechsel
Now, however, we change from a three-dimensional object to text.
Medium. Ist offen für
Text does not need any carrier medium. It's open for tradition, translation, comments, continuation, and transformation,
einen weiteren
such as happened with the portable altar and Gorsche Hall's sculpture.
Text. Selbst auch
The text itself, however, is not ground zero either.
in Jesus sowie die Passion
Especially the stories from Jesus' childhood and from the Passion are very artistic uses of text.
Israel.
Text from the Holy Scriptures of Israel, from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Bible.
Hintergrund der Bibelwort
The Passion
des 22.
story is an interpretation and continuation of Psalm 22.
Der Erzählung liegt ja im Text sozusagen. Interpretative Fortschreibung des
This is an interpretation and a continuation, as I said.
Figurieren
Childhood stories have many motives from prophets of
vermutlich kommen wir mit
Israel.
Texten etwa in die Zeit
These reference texts might bring us back to the times of the so-called Babylonian exile, or the highly productive literary period after the exile,
Jahre
which means another 500 years from the Gospel's creation.
lässt sich
So in some issues, we can trace back how those Hebrew texts are a productive and critical examination of even older Babylonian texts. But this is where all traces end.
dass wir an dieser Stelle zwar in derselben Kunst
We also have to know that we remain in the same art form, text, but that there is a change in language. Hebrew, which is a Semitic language family, to ancient Greek, to the Indo-European languages.
die vor 2500 Jahren
Motives written down 2,500 years ago, but might have been passed on before, have been transformed at first.
neue Gestalt in eine neue
They remain as they have a new form of text,
darin finden Sie eine
the New Testament narratives.
Die Narration wird in einem
Narrative is then
geteilt,
divided into single scenes, which are depicted plastically as reliefs on this portable altar.
unverändert
Another form of remaining in a different form.
werden sie auf kunstvolle Weise
Later on, they will be artfully photographed and put in nature of a park,
dargestellt.
in the environment of a park.
Der Leser
For the first time,
Das Kunstwerk Gorscher Hals,
Quick demise will be notable.
die Dimension,
Gorscher Hals' work of art and its ephemerality
Kunstwerk von Gorscher
consciously also depicts the dimension of time. We see how time forms superimpose, remaining and letting go. Should such a work of art even be renewed, restored, thus robbing it of its own depiction of time? Let me conclude.
eine gewisse Nähe der
We saw a connection between the religious question of how to deal with sacred waste
Objekten,
and sacred objects, and how to deal with works of art, the maintenance of which would demand great efforts. In both cases, we're not only talking about items of use that can be disposed. The difference, however, is that sacred waste is created accidentally.
es gibt ja auch
Vanishing
Vergehen ist hier keine
is not an intended factor.
Das Objekt religiösen
It just happens to this object accidentally, unpreventably, after a certain time, but is not strived for.
heiliger Schriften, Alter,
A copy of Holy Scriptures ages and wears, but this is not intended.
besonders die
Works of art, especially contemporary ones, on the contrary,
Dimension der
often want to
das Vergehen
consciously
und sich.
make
Wir sind auch die
visible how time has its own dimensions and how it vanishes.
dass die religiösen Traditionen Formen eines Rituals
These are my analogies' boundaries.
verhindern, dass das
We must not forget, though, that religious traditions have forms or rituals of letting go
Ritual,
to prevent sacred objects from being just disposed of.
keine pseudo-religiösen Rituale,
But I do not want to ask you to invent pseudo-religious rituals just to let go, but just to ask yourself, how can we let go of artistic artifacts if it goes beyond the act of disposals, just like the rest of sharpening a pencil that you just throw out?
nicht unmittelbar.
I would like to make a case for not only asking if we want to conserve, restore, or archive a work of art, but that we first of all
Kunstwerk inhärent sind.
look at the time forms inherent to the specific piece of art. I would like to talk about own time of a work of art.
Kann erstens unsere
A work of art's own time can trigger our imagination
nicht mehr bloß im Sinne von Vergangenheit
so that in time
sprechen.
we will not only
Diese Wahrnehmung
talk about past, present, and future. This perception of a work of art's own time could also provide hints on what we want to preserve, how we want to preserve it, and what we can let go of.
gleichberechtigt angesehen.
We do not want to apply external categories on, but because we want to see them all as equal.
Freilich
On the contrary, we need to have categories of preserving and letting go. We will not always have the same results. But if we listen to the works of art,
Präferenz.
we will have our decision based on listening to them and not based on externally influenced preferences. That way, pieces of art are not only objects but subjects of the process of administration.